Margaret Washington had lived in the same small house on Maple Street for 43 years. At 72 years old, she moved a little slower than she used to, but her mind was as sharp as ever. The morning sun filtered through her kitchen window as she prepared her usual breakfast of oatmeal and coffee. Her arthritis made simple tasks more difficult, but she refused to let age stop her from maintaining her independence. The neighborhood had changed over the decades. What once was a close-knit community where everyone knew each other had become a place where people kept to themselves. Margaret often felt like one of the few original residents left. She missed the days when children played freely in the streets and neighbors looked out for one another. Officer Derek Collins had been having a particularly frustrating week. 3 years on the police force had not gone as he had imagined. He joined thinking he would make a real difference in the community, but lately he found himself growing more cynical and impatient with each passing day. His supervisor had been pressuring him and his partner about their arrest numbers, suggesting they needed to be more proactive in finding violations. That Tuesday morning, Collins received a call about a possible break-in on Maple Street. A neighbor had reported seeing someone moving around inside a house that they thought might be empty. The caller wasn't entirely sure, but they wanted police to check it out just to be safe. Collins and his partner, Officer Janet Rivers, were dispatched to investigate. As they drove through the quiet residential area, Collins felt his usual frustration building. These calls often turned out to be nothing more than misunderstandings or false alarms. He had been hoping for something more significant to justify his time and possibly improve his standing with his supervisor. Margaret was in her living room, slowly dusting her collection of family photographs when she heard the heavy footsteps on her front porch. She wasn't expecting anyone, and visitors were rare these days. Her son David lived across town and usually called before coming over. She moved carefully toward the front door, her walker helping her maintain balance. The loud, aggressive knocking startled her. It wasn't the gentle knock of a neighbor or the familiar pattern of someone she knew. Margaret approached the door cautiously and called out, asking who was there. The response was immediate and authoritative. "Police! Open the door!" Confused and frightened, Margaret fumbled with the multiple locks on her door. Her hands shook slightly as she tried to turn the deadbolt. The knocking became more insistent, and she could hear voices outside discussing something she couldn't quite make out. She had never had any trouble with the law and couldn't imagine why police would be at her door. When she finally managed to open the door, she found herself face to face with 2 uniformed officers. Collins immediately stepped forward, his hand resting on his service weapon. He looked past Margaret into the house, scanning for any signs of the reported intruder. "Ma'am, we received a report of suspicious activity at this address. We need to check your house to make sure everything is secure," Collins said, his tone more demanding than requesting. Margaret was bewildered. "Suspicious activity? Officer, I live here. This is my home. I've lived here for over 40 years. She reached for her identification, but her movements were slow due to her arthritis and the walker she needed for support. Collins interpreted her slow movements and confusion as potential deception. His training had taught him to be suspicious of anyone who seemed nervous or hesitant during police encounters. He failed to consider that an elderly woman might naturally be frightened and confused by an unexpected police visit. "Ma'am, I need you to step aside so we can verify that you belong here and ensure there are no intruders in the house," Collins insisted, moving closer to the doorway. Margaret tried to explain that she was the homeowner and that there was no one else in the house, but Collins was already pushing past her into the living room. Officer Rivers followed, though she seemed less aggressive and more concerned about the elderly woman's obvious distress. Inside the house, Collins began looking around, opening doors and checking rooms. Margaret followed as quickly as she could with her walker, trying to understand what was happening. She asked repeatedly why they were searching her home and what they were looking for. "Ma'am, we're going to need to see some identification and..." Proof that you live here, Collins demanded, his patience wearing thin. He was beginning to realize this might be another false alarm, which only increased his frustration. Margaret explained that her identification was in her purse, which was in the bedroom. She began moving slowly in that direction, but Collins grew impatient with her pace. The morning was getting away from him, and he had other calls to respond to. "Ma'am, I need you to move faster. We don't have all day," Collins said sharply. Margaret tried to explain about her arthritis and that she was moving as quickly as she could, but Collins seemed unwilling to listen. Officer Rivers suggested they could help the elderly woman retrieve her identification, but Collins was determined to maintain control of the situation. The tension in the house continued to build as Margaret struggled to understand why her morning had suddenly turned into this frightening encounter with law enforcement. She had always respected police officers and had never been in any kind of trouble. The whole situation felt like a terrible misunderstanding that was spiraling out of control. As Margaret finally reached her bedroom and began looking through her purse for her identification, she couldn't help but think about her son, David. He worked as a detective in the same police department, though she wasn't sure if these officers would know him. She wondered if she should mention his name, but decided against it for now, hoping the situation would resolve itself quickly once she could prove she lived in the house. Collins stood in the doorway, watching Margaret search through her belongings. His impatience was evident, and he seemed to view her slow movements as deliberate stalling rather than the natural result of age and physical limitations. The morning that had started so peacefully for Margaret was quickly becoming one of the most frightening experiences of her life. Margaret's hands trembled as she searched through her purse. The simple task of finding her driver's license had become overwhelming under the intense scrutiny of Officer Collins. Her arthritis made her fingers stiff, and the stress of the situation only made everything more difficult. "I know it's in here somewhere," Margaret said softly, her voice shaking. "I just used it at the bank yesterday." She continued searching through the various compartments of her well-organized purse, but Collins's impatient sighing made her even more nervous. "Ma'am, this is taking too long? Are you sure you actually live here?" Collins asked, his tone becoming increasingly suspicious. He had already decided in his mind that something wasn't right about the situation, despite having no evidence to support his suspicions. Officer Rivers watched the interaction with growing concern. She could see that Margaret was genuinely elderly and appeared to be confused and frightened rather than deceptive. The house was clearly lived in, with personal belongings and photographs that suggested a long-term resident. Everything about the situation indicated that Margaret was telling the truth about living there. "Derek, maybe we should slow down a bit," Rivers suggested quietly. "She seems like she really does live here." Collins shot his partner a sharp look. He felt that Rivers was being too soft and that her suggestion undermined his authority. In his mind, they needed to maintain control of the situation and get to the bottom of what he still believed might be a case of trespassing or worse. Margaret finally located her driver's license and held it out with a shaking hand. "Here it is," she said with obvious relief. "You can see my name and address. This is my home." Collins snatched the license from her hand and examined it carefully. The address matched, and the photograph, though several years old, was clearly of Margaret. The evidence was undeniable that she was the legal resident of the house. However, instead of apologizing for the misunderstanding, Collins became more agitated. "This license is old. How do I know you didn't steal it? How do I know you're not some homeless person who broke in here?" Collins demanded, his voice growing louder and more aggressive. Margaret was stunned by the accusation. She had never been accused of any crime in her entire life. She was a retired school teacher who had worked in the community for over 30 years. Many of the local parents still remembered her fondly from when she taught their children. "Officer, I have lived in this house since 1981. I have the deed, mortgage papers, utility bills, everything that proves this is my home. I don't understand why you're treating me like a criminal," Margaret said. her voice growing stronger despite her fear. Collins felt challenged by Margaret's response. In his experience, guilty people often protested their innocence loudly, and he interpreted her defense as further evidence that she was hiding something. His prejudices began to surface as he looked at the elderly African-American woman and made assumptions about her living situation and background. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see additional proof of residence. Driver's license isn't enough," Collins declared, though he had no legal basis for demanding additional documentation from someone in their own home. Rivers stepped forward, trying to de-escalate the situation. "Derek, the license shows this address. Look around the house. There are family photos, personal belongings. Everything indicates she lives here. Maybe we should call this in and get some guidance." But Collins was beyond listening to reason. His frustration with his job, pressure from his supervisor, and his own internal biases had combined to create a perfect storm. He was determined to prove that his instincts were correct, even in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with me to the station so we can verify your identity properly," Collins announced, reaching for his handcuffs. Margaret backed away in terror. "You want to arrest me? In my own home? For what crime?" Her voice cracked with emotion and disbelief. "Suspicious activity, possible trespassing, failure to provide adequate identification," Collins replied, making up charges as he went along. Rivers realized the situation was spiraling completely out of control. "Derek, this is crazy. She's clearly the homeowner. We can't arrest someone for living in their own house." Collins ignored his partner and stepped closer to Margaret. "Ma'am, turn around and put your hands behind your back." Margaret clutched her walker tighter, her mind racing. She thought about her son David and wished desperately that he were there. As a detective, he would know that this was completely wrong. She also thought about calling her neighbor, Mrs. Chen, who had lived next door for 15 years and could vouch for her. "Officer, please call my neighbor. She knows I live here. Or call my son, David Washington. He's a detective with your department. He can tell you who I am," Margaret pleaded. Collins paused for a moment. The name David Washington sounded familiar, but his anger and determination to save face prevented him from thinking clearly. Instead of checking on the information Margaret had provided, he became more aggressive. "Ma'am, I don't have time for games. Turn around now or I'll have to use force." Margaret realized that the officer was serious about arresting her. The whole situation had become a nightmare that she couldn't wake up from. She had done nothing wrong, yet she was being treated like a dangerous criminal in her own home. As Collins reached for Margaret's arm to force her to turn around, she instinctively pulled away. Her movement was purely defensive, but Collins interpreted it as resistance. His training kicked in, and he grabbed Margaret's arm more forcefully. "Don't resist arrest," Collins shouted, though there was no legal basis for any arrest. The physical contact terrified Margaret even more. She had never been handled roughly by anyone, let alone a police officer. Her frail body couldn't withstand the force Collins was applying, and she began to lose her balance despite holding on to her walker. Rivers stepped forward again, this time more forcefully. "Derek, stop. This has gone too far. She's an elderly woman in her own home. We need to back down right now." But Collins was committed to his course of action. In his mind, any sign of resistance justified escalating force. He had crossed a line and now felt he had to follow through to maintain his authority and credibility. The situation escalated beyond anything Officer Rivers could have imagined. Collins grabbed Margaret's arm with unnecessary force, causing her to cry out in pain. Her walker shifted, and she struggled to maintain her balance as the officer attempted to turn her around for handcuffing. "Please, you're hurting me," Margaret gasped, but Collins seemed deaf to her pleas. His grip tightened on her arm, and he pushed her against the wall of her own bedroom. Rivers couldn't stand by any longer. "Derek, let her go. This is completely out of line." She moved toward her partner, but Collins was in a state of tunnel vision, focused only on what he perceived as his duty to subdue a suspect. Margaret's breathing became labored as Collins pressed her against the wall. The combination of fear, physical stress, and her age made it difficult for her to catch her breath. "I can't breathe," she whispered, but Collins interpreted this as another form of resistance. "Stop fighting, and this will be easier," Collins commanded, applying more pressure to keep Margaret against the wall while he fumbled for his handcuffs with his free hand. The elderly woman's legs began to give out under the stress and pressure. Collins, instead of recognizing her physical distress, became more aggressive. He wrapped his arm around Margaret's neck, attempting to control her movements, not realizing that his actions were cutting off her air supply. "Derek, you're choking her! Let go!" Rivers shouted, but her partner seemed completely absorbed in his misguided attempt to make an arrest. Margaret's world began to blur. The pressure on her neck combined with her existing health conditions and the overwhelming stress of the situation created a perfect storm. Her hands clawed weakly at Collins's arm as she struggled to breathe, but her strength was no match for the younger, stronger officer. Rivers made the decision to physically intervene. She grabbed Collins's shoulder and tried to pull him away from Margaret. "She's an old woman. You're going to kill her." The commotion and Rivers's interference finally broke through Collins's focus. He suddenly realized that Margaret had gone, limp in his grip, and was no longer struggling. Her face had taken on a grayish color, and her breathing was barely detectable. "Oh, God," Collins muttered, releasing his grip and stepping back. Margaret slumped against the wall, sliding down to the floor as she gasped for air. Rivers immediately knelt beside Margaret, checking her pulse and trying to assess her condition. "Ma'am, can you hear me? We need to get you medical attention." Margaret's eyes fluttered as she struggled to regain full consciousness. The terror in her eyes was evident as she looked up at the two officers. She tried to speak but could only manage a weak whisper. Collins stood frozen, suddenly realizing the magnitude of what had just happened. He had just assaulted an elderly woman in her own home over what was clearly a false alarm. The implications of his actions began to sink in, and panic started to set in. "We need to call an ambulance," Rivers said firmly, reaching for her radio. "Wait," Collins said, grabbing his partner's arm. "Maybe she's okay. Maybe we don't need to make this bigger than it is." Rivers stared at her partner in disbelief. "Are you serious right now? You just choked an elderly woman who was doing nothing." "Wrong. We absolutely need to get her medical help, and we need to report this immediately," Margaret managed to speak in a raspy voice. "My son, David Washington, detective." The name hit Collins like a freight train. Detective David Washington was well known in the department, respected by both his colleagues and supervisors. Collins had heard the name mentioned numerous times in briefings and department meetings. The realization that he had just assaulted the mother of a fellow officer sent waves of panic through his entire body. Rivers recognized the name as well. She had worked with Detective Washington on several cases and knew him to be a fair professional officer who was well liked throughout the department. The situation had just become exponentially more serious. "Did she say David Washington?" Rivers asked, her voice filled with dread. Collins nodded weakly, the full weight of his actions finally hitting him. He had not only assaulted an innocent, elderly woman, but had attacked the mother of one of the department's most respected detectives. Meanwhile, across town, Detective David Washington was finishing up paperwork at his desk when his phone rang. The caller ID showed his mother's number, which was unusual since she rarely called during his work hours unless something was wrong. David answered on the second ring. "Hi, Mom. Everything okay?" But instead of his mother's familiar voice, he heard commotion in the background and what sounded like his mother's voice, weak and distressed. "David, help me? Mom? Mom, what's happening?" David shouted into the phone, but the line went dead. Without hesitation, David grabbed his keys and badge, informing his sergeant that he had a family emergency. His mother lived alone and rarely asked for help, so any call from her during the day meant something was seriously wrong. As David raced through the city streets toward his mother's house, his mind raced through possibilities. Had she fallen? Was she having a medical emergency? Had someone broken into her house? Each scenario made him press harder on the accelerator. Back at Margaret's house, Rivers had made the decision to call for both medical assistance and backup, despite Collins's protests. She knew that the situation had crossed every line possible, and that attempting to cover it up would only make things worse. "This is Officer Rivers requesting immediate medical assistance and supervisor response to 1247 Maple Street," she spoke into her radio, while keeping one eye on Margaret and another on her increasingly panicked partner. Collins paced back and forth in the small bedroom, his mind racing through possible excuses or explanations that might minimize the consequences of his actions. But every scenario he considered only highlighted how wrong his behavior had been. Margaret remained on the floor, propped against the wall, trying to regain her strength and process what had just happened to her. In her 72 years, she had never experienced anything like this. The violation of her home and her person was almost incomprehensible. The sound of sirens in the distance indicated that help was on the way. But for Collins, those sirens represented the end of his career and possibly his freedom. He had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and the consequences were rapidly approaching. The ambulance arrived first, followed closely by a police supervisor and 2 additional patrol units. The small house on Maple Street suddenly became the center of intense activity as emergency responders rushed to assess Margaret's condition and secure the scene. Paramedic Sarah Chen immediately took charge of Margaret's care, checking her vital signs and examining the obvious bruising around her neck. The elderly woman was conscious, but clearly shaken, and her breathing was still somewhat labored from the trauma she had endured. "Ma'am, my name is Sarah. I'm going to take good care of you," the paramedic said gently, trying to provide comfort, while conducting her medical assessment. "Can you tell me what happened?" Margaret's voice was hoarse and weak as she tried to explain the events. "The officer, he grabbed me. I couldn't breathe." She pointed weakly toward Collins, who stood in the corner looking pale and desperate. Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, the supervising officer, immediately separated Collins and Rivers to get independent accounts of what had transpired. He had been on the force for over 20 years and had seen many difficult situations. But the scene before him was deeply troubling. "Rivers, I need you to tell me exactly what happened here," Rodriguez said, pulling the female officer aside, while Collins remained under the watchful eye of another officer. Rivers took a deep breath before beginning her account. She knew that her testimony would likely end her partner's career, but she also knew that staying silent would make her complicit in what amounted to assault on an elderly civilian. "Sergeant, we responded to a call about suspicious activity. When we arrived, we found Mrs. Washington in her own home. She provided identification proving she lived here, but Collins refused to accept it. He became increasingly aggressive and eventually physically assaulted her." Rodriguez's expression grew more serious with each detail. "Did you attempt to intervene?" "Yes, sir. Multiple times. I told Collins that she was clearly the homeowner and that we needed to back down, but he wouldn't listen. When he started choking her, I tried to pull him off." Meanwhile, David Washington was driving through his mother's neighborhood when he saw the collection of emergency vehicles outside her house. His heart stopped as he realized that whatever emergency his mother was facing was serious enough to require multiple responders. David parked quickly and ran toward the house, his detective badge clearly visible on his belt. The officers securing the perimeter recognized him immediately, and their expressions told him that the situation was even worse than he had feared. "Detective Washington, you need to speak with Sergeant Rodriguez before going inside." One of the officers informed him, though David could see through the open door that his mother was being treated by paramedics. Rodriguez emerged from the house and approached David with a grim expression. The sergeant had worked with David on several cases and respected him as both an officer and a person. Having to deliver this news to a fellow detective made an already difficult situation even more painful. "David, I need to prepare you for what you're about to see. Your mother was assaulted by one of our officers during what should have been a routine welfare check." David felt the blood drain from his face. "Assaulted? By a police officer? What are you talking about?" Rodriguez explained the basic facts of what had occurred, watching as David's expression shifted from confusion to anger to barely controlled rage. The detective's hands clenched into fists as he processed the information that his elderly mother had been attacked in her own home by someone wearing the same badge he wore. "Where is this officer now?" David asked through gritted teeth. "He's in custody and will be facing serious charges. David, I know this is impossible to accept, but I need you to let us handle this properly. Going in there angry won't help your mother right now." David nodded, though every instinct told him to confront the officer who had hurt his mother. His training as a detective helped him understand that maintaining the integrity of the investigation was crucial for ensuring justice, even though his personal feelings demanded immediate action. Inside the house, Collins was becoming increasingly desperate as he realized the full scope of the consequences he was facing. Not only had he assaulted an innocent elderly woman, but he had attacked the mother of a respected colleague. The incident would undoubtedly become a major scandal for the department. "Sergeant, it was a misunderstanding. She was resisting, and I was just trying to maintain control of the situation," Collins tried to explain, but his words sounded hollow even to himself. Rodriguez had heard enough excuses from bad officers over the years to recognize deflection and denial. "Collins, there is no justification for what happened here. You assaulted an elderly woman in her own home after she provided valid identification. Your actions were completely outside the bounds of acceptable police conduct." The paramedics had stabilized Margaret's condition, but they recommended transport to the hospital for further evaluation and treatment. The bruising around her neck was concerning, and her age made any injury potentially serious. As Margaret was being prepared for transport, she asked for her son. David was finally allowed to approach her, and the sight of his mother's injuries filled him with a combination of heartbreak and fury. "Mom, I'm here." "You're going to be okay," David said softly, taking her hand while being careful not to interfere with the paramedics' work. Margaret looked up at her son with tears in her eyes. "David, I don't understand what happened. I was just having breakfast, and then these officers came to my door. I showed them my identification, but he wouldn't listen." David felt his jaw clench as he heard the pain and confusion in his mother's voice. She had always been proud of his choice to become a police officer, often telling her friends about her son who served the community. Now, an officer wearing the same uniform had traumatized her in the worst possible way. "Mom, we're going to make sure this never happens again. The officer who did this will be held accountable," David promised, though he struggled to maintain his professional composure. As the ambulance prepared to leave for the hospital, Rodriguez approached David again. "I know this is difficult, but we're going to need a statement from your mother when she's able to provide one. We're also going to need you to stay clear of the investigation to avoid any conflicts of interest." David understood the protocol, but it felt wrong to step aside when his own mother was the victim. However, he also knew that his involvement could potentially compromise the case against Collins and possibly allow the officer to escape full accountability. Collins was formally arrested and read his rights before being transported to the station for booking. As he was led away in handcuffs, he avoided eye contact with the other officers present, knowing that word of his actions would spread throughout the department within hours. The incident that had begun as a simple welfare check had escalated into a nightmare that would have lasting consequences for everyone involved. Margaret would carry the trauma of the assault. David would struggle with the knowledge that his mother had been hurt by someone in his profession, and Collins would face both criminal charges and the end of his law enforcement career. As the emergency vehicles began to clear the scene, Neighbors started to emerge to see what had happened at Margaret's house. Many of them had known her for years and couldn't imagine what could have brought so many police and paramedics to her quiet street. At the hospital, Margaret underwent a thorough medical examination to assess the extent of her injuries. The emergency room doctor, Dr. Patricia Kim, was deeply concerned about the bruising around Margaret's neck and the potential for internal damage from the choking incident. "Mrs. Washington, I want to keep you here for observation for at least 24 hours, Dr. Kim explained gently. "The bruising indicates significant pressure was applied to your neck, and we need to monitor you for any delayed complications." David sat beside his mother's hospital bed, still struggling to process what had happened. As a detective, he had investigated cases of police misconduct before, but having his own family become a victim made the experience entirely different. The professional distance he usually maintained was impossible when the victim was his own. "Mother?" "Son, I keep thinking about what I could have done differently," Margaret said softly, her voice still hoarse from the trauma. "Maybe if I had moved faster, or if I had mentioned your name sooner." David took his mother's hand carefully, mindful of the IV lines. "Mom, you did nothing wrong. Nothing at all. That officer had no right to treat you that way regardless of the circumstances. You were in your own home, you provided identification, and you posed no threat to anyone." Meanwhile, back at the police station, the incident was causing shockwaves throughout the department. Chief of Police Robert Martinez had been briefed on the situation and immediately ordered a full internal investigation in addition to the criminal charges that would be filed against Collins. Word spread quickly among the officers, and Detective Washington's colleagues began reaching out to offer their support. Many of them had met Margaret at department family events and knew her as a kind, gentle woman who was proud of her son's service to the community. Detective Lisa Rodriguez, David's partner, arrived at the hospital as soon as she heard the news. She had worked with David for 3 years and considered him one of the best officers she had ever partnered with. Seeing his mother injured by a fellow officer was devastating for everyone who knew them. "David, I am so sorry," Lisa said, her voice filled with emotion. "If there's anything you need, anything at all, just ask." David appreciated the support from his colleagues, but he also struggled with conflicting emotions about his profession. He had dedicated his career to upholding justice and protecting the innocent, yet someone wearing the same badge had brutalized his elderly mother in her own home. Collins, meanwhile, was processed through the jail system like any other criminal defendant. The charges against him were serious: assault, battery, false imprisonment, and civil rights violations. His police career was effectively over, and he faced the possibility of several years in prison. The officers' union representative, attorney James Peterson, met with Collins to discuss his legal options. However, even Peterson, who had defended officers in numerous controversial cases, was troubled by the evidence against his client. "Derek, I have to be honest with you. The evidence against you is overwhelming. You assaulted an elderly woman in her own home after she provided valid identification. There's no legal justification for your actions," Peterson explained bluntly. Collins still tried to justify his behavior. "She was acting suspicious, and she resisted when I tried to arrest her." Peterson shook his head. "Derek, you had no probable cause for an arrest. She was in her own home with valid identification. Any resistance on her part would have been completely justified under the circumstances." News of the incident began to spread beyond the police department as local media picked up the story. The headline, "Police Officer Assaults Elderly Woman in Her Own Home," quickly became front-page news, adding to the department's public relations nightmare. Chief Martinez called a press conference to address the incident and demonstrate that the department was taking it seriously. Standing behind a podium filled with microphones, he faced a room full of reporters eager for details about the shocking case. "Yesterday, one of our officers engaged in conduct that was completely contrary to our values and training. Mrs. Margaret Washington, A 72-year-old resident of our community was assaulted in her own home by Officer Derek Collins during what should have been a routine welfare check. The chief continued, Officer Collins has been terminated from the department and is facing serious criminal charges. We will cooperate fully with the prosecution and have launched our own internal investigation to determine if there were any systemic failures that contributed to this incident. David watched the press conference from his mother's hospital room, feeling a mixture of satisfaction that the department was taking the matter seriously and continued anger about what had happened to his mother. Margaret observed her son's emotional struggle and felt guilty that her situation was causing him such pain. David, I don't want this to affect how you feel about your job. What that officer did doesn't reflect on you or the other good officers. But David wasn't sure he could separate his personal experience from his professional identity so easily. The badge that had always been a source of pride now felt heavy with the knowledge that someone wearing the same symbol had terrorized his mother. Officer Rivers, meanwhile, was receiving counseling support from the department. Her decision to intervene and report her partner's actions had been the right thing to do, but it was still emotionally difficult to testify against a fellow officer. I keep thinking about what might have happened if I hadn't been there, Rivers confided to the department counselor. Collins was completely out of control. Mrs. Washington could have been seriously injured or even killed. The counselor nodded understandingly. You did exactly what you were supposed to do. Your actions may have saved Mrs. Washington's life, and your testimony will be crucial in ensuring justice is served. Back in his jail cell, Collins finally began to grasp the full magnitude of his actions. The adrenaline and anger that had driven his behavior had faded, leaving him to confront the reality of what he had done. He had destroyed his career, faced serious criminal charges, and traumatized an innocent elderly woman. His wife, Jennifer, visited him at the jail, struggling to understand how the man she married had become capable of such violence. Derek, how could you do this? She's somebody's mother, somebody's grandmother. Collins couldn't meet his wife's eyes. I don't know. Everything just got out of control so fast. I thought I was doing my job. Jennifer shook her head sadly. Your job was to protect people, not hurt them. I don't even know who you are anymore. The community response to the incident was swift and strong. Margaret's neighbors organized to show their support, bringing flowers and cards to her house and expressing their outrage about what had happened to such a beloved member of their community. Mrs. Chen, Margaret's next-door neighbor, spoke to reporters outside Margaret's house. Mrs. Washington is one of the kindest people I know. She taught half the children in this neighborhood at some point. What happened to her is absolutely unacceptable. The incident also sparked broader conversations about police accountability and the need for better training and oversight. Community leaders called for reforms to prevent similar incidents from occurring in the future. As Margaret spent her first night in the hospital, she found it difficult to sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she relived the terrifying moments, when Collins had grabbed her and pressed her against the wall. The feeling of helplessness and fear would stay with her long after her physical injuries healed. 3 months after the incident, Collins stood before Judge Maria Santos for his sentencing hearing. The courtroom was packed with community members, police officers, and media representatives who had followed the case closely. Margaret sat in the front row, supported by her son David and several family members. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Rachel Torres, presented a compelling case for significant prison time. Your Honor, the defendant's actions represent a fundamental betrayal of the trust placed in law enforcement officers. Mrs. Washington was assaulted in her own home by someone who had sworn to protect and serve the community. Collins had pleaded guilty to all charges in a plea agreement that spared Margaret from having to testify at trial. His defense attorney had advised him that fighting the charges would be futile given the overwhelming evidence and witness testimony from Officer Rivers. Mrs. Washington suffered not only physical injuries but lasting psychological trauma from this attack, Torres continued. She now lives in fear in the home where she once felt safe. The defendant's actions have damaged not only Mrs. Washington, but the entire community's trust in law enforcement. Margaret had prepared a victim impact statement, which David helped her read to the court. Her voice was stronger now than it had been in the hospital, but the emotion was still evident as she spoke about how the incident had changed her life. Your Honor, before that day, I felt safe in my home. I respected police officers and was proud that my son chose to serve in law enforcement. Officer Collins took that sense of security away from me. I now have nightmares and panic attacks. Simple tasks like answering my door have become sources of fear. Margaret paused, gathering her strength before continuing. But I don't want my experience to reflect on all the good officers who serve our community with honor. My son and his colleagues represent the best of law enforcement. Officer Collins represents everything that's wrong when power is abused, Udyr. Santos listened carefully to all the testimony before delivering her sentence. She had reviewed the case thoroughly and was deeply troubled by Collins's actions and his apparent lack of genuine remorse. Mr. Collins, your actions on that morning were inexcusable. You violated your oath as a police officer and traumatized an innocent elderly woman in her own home. The badge you wore was meant to protect people like Mrs. Washington, not terrorize them. The judge sentenced Collins to 3 years in state prison, followed by 2 years of supervised probation. She also ordered him to pay restitution for Margaret's medical expenses and counseling costs, and banned him from ever working in law enforcement again. As Collins was led away in handcuffs, Margaret felt a sense of closure but also sadness. She took no joy in seeing another person's life destroyed, even someone who had hurt her so badly. The police department implemented significant changes in the wake of the incident. Chief Martinez established new training protocols focused on de-escalation and cultural sensitivity. He also created a civilian oversight board to review complaints against officers and ensure accountability. Officer Rivers was commended for her courage in intervening and reporting her partner's misconduct. She was promoted to detective and became an advocate within the department for ethical policing practices. David struggled for several months with his feelings about his profession, but ultimately decided to stay on the force. He felt that he could honor his mother's experience by working to ensure that such incidents never happened again. He became involved in training new recruits, emphasizing the importance of treating all community members with dignity and respect. Margaret slowly began to heal, both physically and emotionally. The community's support helped her regain some of her confidence, and she eventually returned to her volunteer work at the local library. However, she never fully regained the sense of complete security she had once felt in her own home. The incident sparked broader reforms throughout the city's police department and influenced policy changes at the state level. Margaret's case became a catalyst for improved police training and accountability measures that would benefit countless other citizens. Mrs. Chen, Margaret's neighbor, organized a neighborhood watch program that brought the community closer together. The residents of Maple Street, who had once barely spoken to each other, now looked out for one another in ways they never had before. 6 months after the incident, Margaret received a letter from Collins in prison. In it, he apologized for his actions and expressed genuine remorse for the pain he had caused. Margaret was conflicted about the letter, but ultimately decided to respond, telling Collins that she forgave him, but hoped he would use his experience to become a better person. David framed his mother's victim impact statement and kept it on his desk at work as a daily reminder of why he became a police officer. It served as motivation to always treat every person he encountered with the respect and dignity they deserved. The case also attracted national attention and became part of discussions about police reform across the country. Margaret found herself reluctantly thrust into the spotlight as an advocate for police accountability, though she always emphasized that most officers were good people who served their communities honorably. A year later, Margaret had largely returned to her normal routine, though she remained more cautious than before. She had installed a security system and always asked for identification before opening her door to anyone she didn't recognize. The incident had changed her, but it hadn't broken her spirit. The community continued to rally around Margaret, and she became something of a local hero for her courage in speaking out about what had happened to her. Local schools invited her to speak about resilience and forgiveness, and she always emphasized the importance of standing up for what's right. Collins served his full sentence and was released after 3 years. He moved to another state and found work in construction, forever banned from law enforcement. He continued to struggle with the consequences of his actions and the knowledge that his moment of poor judgment had caused so much pain. The incident on Maple Street became a turning point for the police department and the community. It demonstrated that accountability was possible when good officers like Rivers stood up to misconduct, when prosecutors took police crimes seriously, and when communities demanded justice for all their members. Margaret Washington, the elderly, woman who had simply been having breakfast in her own home, had become an unlikely symbol of courage and resilience. Her experience, while traumatic, had led to positive changes that would protect others from similar abuse of power. In the end, justice had been served, but the real victory was in the reforms and cultural changes that emerged from Margaret's terrible ordeal. Her suffering had not been in vain if it prevented other innocent people from experiencing similar trauma at the hands of those sworn to protect them.